The sound of water never stopped. Not in the dead of night, not during winter storms, not even when Ethan Rollins lay flat on the wooden floor of his cabin, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each throb of pain in his knee. The waterfall roared less than 200 yards from his porch, a constant reminder that time moved forward even when life felt frozen in place. Some called Ravenon Falls majestic, healing, spiritual. To Ethan, it was camouflage, a perfect place to vanish without vanishing, a ghost with a mailbox. The town had stopped whispering about him to his face years ago, but he could feel the words hanging in the air whenever he limped into the general store for supplies. Crazy Marine, the one who got his squad killed. PTSD freak living like a hermit. They didn't say it at the diner when he came for black coffee. They didn't dare look him in the eye, but he watched how they moved around him like something radioactive, creating a bubble of empty space that followed him wherever he went. Maybe he preferred it that way. He hadn't always been this hollowed-out man with a limp and a beard that refused to stay trimmed. Once he'd led men into fire and brought most of them back. Once he'd believed in medals, in missions, in people. Then came Fallujah. Then came the radio silence that wasn't supposed to happen. Then came the blast that shattered his knee and killed 3 of his men. Then came the silence that never left. Scout was the only one who didn't look at him like a cracked mirror. The Belgian Malinois was 11 now, graying at the snout, slow in the joints, but sharper than any memory Ethan could trust. They'd found each other at a VA shelter, both unwanted for different reasons. Scout had been deemed too aggressive for most families after his previous handler died, while Ethan had been deemed too broken for normal society. Since then, they'd moved through the years like two halves of a broken rifle, silent, lethal in loyalty, and never fully operational. Morning came with the smell of pine and mist. Ethan's routine never varied. Coffee black, eggs cold, and Scout already on patrol around the cabin's perimeter before sunrise. He didn't bother locking his door anymore. If someone came for him, let them come. He didn't sleep heavy, and Scout didn't miss a sound. This morning, Scout's bark broke the rhythm. Not his usual 2 short, 1 long alert for raccoons or coyotes. This was sharp, insistent, urgent, a get-your-ass-here-now kind of bark. Ethan dropped the half-cracked ceramic mug in the sink and limped out the door. Boots half-laced, sidearm tucked into his waistband more from habit than necessity. Scout stood stiff at the far edge of the clearing, staring down at the base of the stone sculpture Ethan had carved into the bluff himself years ago, a crude tribute to nothing in particular, just a habit of a man who didn't want to forget his hands could still shape things. Scout, Ethan's voice was low but firm. The dog didn't look back. Instead, he growled, then began scratching at the base of the statue. Not digging for pleasure or boredom, but scratching with focus, like trying to peel away something he couldn't see but could smell. Ethan limped closer, his knee locking halfway down the 3 wooden steps. "It's just stone," he muttered. But as Scout kept clawing, Ethan knelt and touched the spot the dog had been targeting. The texture wasn't right. It looked like stone, but it crumbled too easily beneath his fingers. Beneath the outer layer was a fissure, small but jagged. And when Ethan leaned closer, the breeze shifted, carrying up a scent so out of place it made his stomach tighten. Iron, rust, and something faintly organic. Blood, old but distinct. He pressed his ear against the cracked surface. Nothing. Then, shifting his head slightly, he caught it, a hollow echo from within. There was a cavity inside the rock, large enough for sound to bounce. Scout stepped back and sat, tail thumping once, eyes never leaving Ethan. "What the hell did you find, boy?" Ethan whispered, brushing away more of the fake stone. Beneath the thin shell, layers of brick and mortar emerged, weathered, hand-shaped, not machine-cut. This wasn't part of his cabin. This wasn't part of anything listed on his land records. He'd checked those himself when he bought the property a decade ago. This was something else. Something buried. Something hidden. Ethan stood, brushing dirt from his jeans and looked toward the tree line. Nothing but pines and fog rolling in from the valley. He turned back to Scout, who still sat watching him, ears forward, alert but patient. "All right," Ethan's voice dry as he reached for the tool shed key clipped to his belt loop. "Let's see what history decided to forget." That night, Ethan sat on the porch with Scout at his feet, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He hadn't told anyone about the discovery. Not yet. He'd widened the fissure enough to see down into blackness. The metal smell was stronger now, and the air that came up was cold and dry, unnatural for this region and season. A tunnel, maybe, a storage space, or a grave. He stared beyond the thundering falls. Somewhere behind that curtain of mist and rock, stories had been sealed off. Not for weather, not for time, but for silence. Scout nudged his boot and laid his head down with a soft whine. "Guess we're not done yet," Ethan whispered, his hand finding the warm fur behind the dog's ear. "Tomorrow we go deeper." The morning arrived gray and thick with mist, the kind that pressed against the lungs and made every sound feel muffled. The waterfall, usually sharp in its roar, now throbbed like a heartbeat beneath gauze. Ethan stood before the fractured base of the bluff sculpture, a pry bar in one hand, Scout at his side. The stone shell had given way the day before, revealing brick beneath, and now Ethan was determined to see it through. His breath fogged in the cold morning air as he inserted the edge of the tool into the fissure and pressed. The bricks cracked, flaked, then caved with a low groan like a held breath finally released. They tumbled forward, clanking down into the wet dirt. Dust rose, bitter and ancient. Behind the crumbled wall yawned a gap about shoulder width, leading into darkness. Ethan knelt beside it, Scout standing rigid, tail straight, ears pinned forward. "Stay," Ethan commanded. But Scout inched forward anyway, nose twitching at the strange scents wafting from the opening. Ethan pulled a flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the dust like a scalpel. Wooden steps descended beyond the gap, steep and narrow, aged boards painted in a reddish hue that could have been cedar stain or could have been something else. Dried streaks along the edge looked like they might once have been blood. Ethan's knuckles tightened around the flashlight. He ducked and moved inside, Scout following without hesitation. The air changed immediately, heavy and still, the kind of silence that felt inhabited. Each step creaked, not from his weight, but from memory. The beam of light caught dust particles suspended in the air, like ghosts that hadn't yet figured out how to let go. The stairwell ended in a small corridor, maybe 5 feet wide, with walls lined in warped wood paneling. The floor was plank wood, dry and brittle. About 10 feet in, the light caught something carved low along the wall, tiny hands smudged into the wood grain. Not painted, pressed. Children's handprints, uneven and trembling, some with fingernails clearly marked as if the hands had dragged. Names were etched beside them, not all legible. One said Tommy, another might have been Lena. They were scratched in desperation, some letters backward, some unfinished, as if the hands that made them had been pulled away mid-word. Ethan's pulse kicked up in his neck, and Scout gave a soft whine, then stopped at a corner where the hall turned abruptly. There, mounted crudely into the stone wall, was a rusted iron beam with a row of hooks. 7 of them, each bent in odd directions, each one stained dark at the tips. Shackles hung from 2 of the hooks, the chains twisted, one broken clean at the midpoint like it had been yanked too hard. The floor beneath the rack was discolored, as if something had pooled and dried over and over again. Ethan stepped closer, flashlight steady, hand hovering near the sidearm at his belt out of reflex, though he knew the danger here had long since passed, or maybe not. Above the rack, black streaks lined the stone in crude charcoal. A message rushed and jagged, slanted downward in uneven lines. 4 words that made his blood run cold. We screamed. No one came. Ethan stood still. He didn't breathe. The lettering trembled in the beam, not from motion but from the way it had been written. Hands shaking, perhaps bleeding. He imagined the moment someone pressed against cold stone, pleading, begging, and knowing even as they wrote that no one was coming. He blinked, swallowing down the knot that rose in his throat. "Jesus," he muttered, barely audible. Not a prayer, just a reaction. Scout stepped forward, sniffed the floor, then looked up at him with amber eyes that seemed to understand too much. Ethan crouched, running his hand lightly over the message, then over the stone below it. Faint grooves were still visible beneath the dirt. Not just writing, but scratch marks, as if someone had been dragged, as if someone had fought. As if this tunnel had once held lives, and not by choice. Further down the hall, the air grew colder. denser. Ethan moved slowly now, knees stiff, boots careful not to splinter the old boards. The corridor dipped again, revealing another chamber, larger, about the size of a small room, maybe 15 feet square. The floor here was raw dirt with remnants of wood beams collapsed into dust. In the far corner, a pile of old clothes, shredded and gray, lay against the wall as if someone had tried to build a nest. Above them, more markings, symbols, circles within circles, a star, and a set of initials. B.A. carved over and over again. Scout growled low in his throat, then backed up a step. Ethan didn't move. He stared at the initials, then at the handprints, then at the rusted hooks. This wasn't a storage tunnel. It wasn't a root cellar. It wasn't even just a holding place. It was something darker, something buried intentionally, something that had been built not to protect but to disappear. He walked to the clothes, reached out and pulled the top layer aside. Beneath it was a boot, child-sized, molded into the earth, soul eaten by decay. He stepped back, heart thudding in a way that wasn't fear but something worse, recognition. This place had held children. Not for a day, but for long enough that they left marks. Ethan looked back at Scout, who now sat by the doorway, tense, waiting. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. The waterfall rumbled above them like a giant drawing breath. And somewhere deeper inside the walls, Ethan could swear he heard something shift. Not stone, not wind, something. Ethan stood in the chamber, the beam of his flashlight trembling against the stone, the words on the wall still echoing in his skull. He forced himself to breathe, to push through the clench in his chest, because if he stopped, the silence might press him flat. Scout had moved forward now, paws firm against the dirt floor, head low, ears pricked as though he sensed more waiting in the shadows. Ethan's boots crunched softly against soil packed tight by time as he crossed to the opposite wall, scanning every inch. The old wood beams sagged, remnants of something once meant to brace the chamber, long since surrendered to decay. Dust swirled in the light, and then his boot hit something solid, different from the ground. He crouched, brushed away dirt with his gloved hand, and a square edge emerged. Metal, thin, rust-eaten, about the size of a wallet. He pulled harder, and the earth released it with a reluctant groan. It was an old tin box, dented at the corners, lid barely hanging on. With a careful tug, it came open, and inside, wrapped in layers of brittle paper, were 7 laminated cards. Ethan pulled one free, wiped the surface clean. A face stared back, faded but still visible. A woman, maybe 30, eyes dark, name beneath. Clara Ellis, 1956. The next card, another face, another year. Each one carried the same weight, and as Ethan lined them out in the dirt, the years spelled a pattern. 1956, 1961, 1968, 1973, 1977, 1980, 1982. 7 people, 7 names. He read them slowly, voice dry as if giving them back breath. Clara Ellis, Frank Hensley, Ruth Barker, Samuel Coates, Daniel Fry, Margaret Holt, Lewis Quinn. Scout shifted, tail brushing against the dirt, head tilted like he understood the gravity of what they'd found. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew 2 of those names, not from history books, but from faded articles clipped to the back pages of Ravenon's tiny weekly paper. He remembered them because his father used to talk about them in hushed tones, stories that never made the front page. People who had spoken out about the land deals, who'd accused Ravenon Logging Company of falsifying surveys, of poisoning creeks, of forcing farmers into foreclosure. Each had vanished. No body, no trace, just missing. Officially presumed runaway or family dispute. No closure. Now their IDs lay in his palm, sealed underground with shackles and children's handprints. Jesus Christ, Ethan whispered. The words barely sound. He shoved the box into his pack and kept scanning. The chamber had more to give. He ran his flashlight along the lower seam of the wall, and there, wedged into a gap between 2 stones, was a corner of thick paper. He pried it loose, careful not to tear. It was a folded map, edges stiff and yellowed. He spread it slowly on the floor, the beam sweeping across lines drawn in ink. The paper was stamped in faded black letters across the top. Property of Ravenon Logging Company, restricted access by federal order, 1947. The faded seal beneath the stamp bore the insignia of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, confirming this was no local decree, but a federal designation tied to post-war land contracts. Ethan froze. He read it twice, 3 times. The paper crackled in his hands. Federal order, restricted access, 1947. That was 2 years after the war ended, when the government had been pouring contracts into private hands under the guise of rebuilding. He knew enough military history to recognize the implications. Ravenon Logging hadn't just been cutting trees. They'd been given authority by federal mandate to use the land however they saw fit. And this chamber, this tunnel, had been part of it. He traced the map with his finger. Sections of the forest marked off in bold lines, parcels labeled with numbers. And here at the base of the falls, a black square drawn like a warning. Beside it, small handwritten letters, holding facility. His throat went dristy. Scout growled suddenly, sharp and low, the kind of growl he hadn't made in years, back in the shelter when anyone tried to touch Ethan without warning. Ethan raised the light quickly, sweeping it across the chamber. Nothing moved. The air hung heavy, pressing against his skin, but something in his gut shifted. He tucked the map into his jacket, stood slowly, and ran his hand along the stones again. There were more scratches, faint, layered over years, names half-finished, a date etched clumsily, 1907, a child's drawing of a house, and beneath it, another phrase carved shallow, as if someone had been too weak to press hard. Tell them we were here. Ethan staggered back, heart slamming, the ID still clutched in his hand. 7 people, 7 years, 7 ghosts hidden beneath federal paper. And now, in the silence of the tunnel, the weight of it pressed harder than the stone overhead. Scout barked once, sharp, ears trained toward the next quarter. Ethan steadied himself, flashlight beams shaking across the rough walls, and knew there was more beyond this chamber. More than names and maps. He adjusted the strap on his pack, reaching down to scratch Scout's ear once, not for the dog's comfort, but for his own, then stepped forward, deeper into the dark, the sound of the falls now muffled into nothing but a memory overhead. Back in his cabin, Ethan spread the evidence across his kitchen table. The IDs formed a timeline that spanned nearly 3 decades, and as he researched each name online, a pattern emerged. Clara Ellis, environmental activist, who challenged Ravenon Logging's dumping practices in the local waterways. Frank Hensley, union organizer who tried to unionize loggers in 1961. Ruth Barker, local teacher who refused to sell her family farm for the company's expansion. Each one had a story. Each one had stood against Ravenon Logging. Each one had been erased. The post-war years made more sense now. Ethan pulled up historical archives about land acquisition in the late 1940s, when the government had granted extraordinary powers to private companies deemed essential for national rebuilding. Timber was crucial for the construction boom, and companies like Ravenon Logging received not just contracts, but authority, backed by federal mandate, to secure resources by all necessary means. It was a blank check written in the name of patriotism and progress, and someone in Ravenon had cashed it in blood. The map told its own story. Parcels marked with dates corresponded with property transfers in county records, farms and homesteads that suddenly changed hands after generations of family ownership. Next to each parcel was a code that Ethan couldn't decipher, but the pattern was clear enough. Where resistance had occurred, people disappeared. Where people disappeared, Ravenon Logging expanded. What troubled him most were the children's handprints. The holding facility hadn't just contained adults who fought back, it had imprisoned their families. Hostages, perhaps, to force compliance, or witnesses who couldn't be allowed to speak. When the sun rose the following day, Ethan knew he needed legal advice. This wasn't something he could take to the local sheriff, not in a town where the name Ravenon Logging still graced the high school gymnasium and the public library. He needed someone with distance, with authority. He dressed in his cleanest clothes, not much of an improvement, and drove his battered truck into town. The law office of Peterson and Cole occupied a limestone building across from the courthouse, the only firm in Ravenon with any history to speak of. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect hair and a hollow smile, asked him to wait. 40 minutes later, he was ushered into an office where Martin Peterson, senior partner, sat behind a desk that looked older than the state itself. I understand you found something concerning on your property, Mr. Rollins. Peterson's voice carried more dismissal than courtesy, hands folded like he was already tired of the conversation. Ethan explained about the tunnel, the IDs, the federal map, careful to omit exact locations. Peterson's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes shifted when Ethan mentioned the Corps of Engineers seal. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Rollins, I'm advising you, for your own good, drop whatever nonsense you think you found. It won't bring you peace and it won't hold up in court. If I were you, I'd seal that tunnel back up and forget you ever saw it. But these people disappeared. There are records, there's evidence. Hearsay at best, Peterson cut him off. And even if there were something to find, the statute of limitations expired decades ago. This town has moved on. I suggest you do the same. Don't come back here. Ethan left the office with his jaw clenched so tight it ached. The dismissal wasn't surprising, but the speed of it was. Peterson hadn't even feigned interest or asked to see the evidence. It was as if he already knew what Ethan had found and had a ready answer prepared. The truck's engine groaned as he pulled away from the curb. He'd expected the town's lawyers to shut him out. What he didn't expect came hours later as he sat in his cabin, Scout at his feet, the evidence spread across the table once more. His ancient laptop pinged with an email. Unknown sender. Subject line, they won't tell you, but I will. Against his better judgment, Ethan opened it. Attached were scanned documents, decades old, typed on thin paper with government headers. The first page read, Incident Report, Ravenon Logging Company, Fatality 1961. It described a sawmill accident, except the details didn't read like an accident at all. The blade that killed Henry Pike, a 43-year-old logger, had been tampered with, bolts loosened intentionally. Witness testimony was attached, but each witness had signed under duress, notes in the margins indicated. Another document detailed a landslide in 1973 that buried 3 homes. The report claimed natural causes, but the scans revealed internal memos showing Ravenon Logging had detonated charges uphill to clear space for a road. The memos included directives from executives. Ensure families accept relocation settlements. Control narrative at all costs. Ethan leaned back, the glow of the laptop flickering across his lined face. His throat felt raw. He scrolled to the last page and found a signature at the bottom. Judge William Harlan, 1977. Sealed, archived, buried. The email had no body text, no sender name, just the scans. Ethan shut the laptop, rubbed his temples. His father had warned him once, before the cancer took him, that Ravenon Logging was not just a company. They built this town, his father had said, and they'll bury anyone who questions it. Now Ethan had proof. But proof was only powerful if someone was willing to look at it. The next morning, he didn't even get to decide what to do with it. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up outside his cabin just as he finished his coffee. Scout was already on alert, growling low at the approaching tires. Sheriff Ray Callahan stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that never reached his eyes. He wore his badge like armor and carried himself like a man who'd never been told no. Ethan stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, body coiled with a soldier's caution. Morning, Rollins, Callahan said, voice smooth but sharp. Mind if we talk? It wasn't a question. Ethan said nothing, just waited. The sheriff stepped closer, boots crunching on frost. Word is you've been digging where you shouldn't, breaking into historical property, destroying structures that might belong to the Federal Registry. That's a crime, you know. Ethan's jaw tightened. That structure you're talking about isn't in any record. You know it, and I know it. Callahan smiled, thin and wolfish. Doesn't matter. The law is what we say it is. And right now, I'm saying you either hand over whatever you found, or I start paperwork to charge you with destruction of federal property. The sheriff tapped a folded notice from his pocket, a county-issued emergency protective order declaring the bluff a historical site, filed just days earlier. Paper armor twisted into a weapon. Scout barked sharply, teeth flashing, but Ethan raised a hand and the dog stilled. Ethan locked eyes with Callahan, saw the calculation there. The quiet threat. You think you can scare me into silence? Callahan's smile vanished. His tone dropped. I don't think. I know. This town tolerates you because you stay quiet. Start making noise and you'll learn real quick just how alone you are out here. He adjusted his hat, stepped back toward his cruiser. Think about it, Rollins. You've got no allies, just that mud of yours. And dogs don't testify in court. He left, tires spitting gravel. Ethan stood on the porch, Scout pressed against his leg, both of them watching the cruiser fade down the mountain road. The sheriff's words rang in his ears, heavy, deliberate, like a verdict already written. He clenched his fists, the weight of the old documents in his cabin now feeling hotter than fire, proof and danger bound together. He knew one thing. If Callahan had come this quickly, then someone else already knew what he had seen, and they would not stop at threats. 3 days passed with Ethan on constant alert. He slept in short bursts, kept the evidence packed in a waterproof bag, and maintained Scout on a closer patrol perimeter. The tunnel remained his secret, a wound in the earth that held answers to questions the town had stopped asking decades ago. On the third night, as mist rolled in thick from the valley, he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees. Not that he expected a frontal assault. Men like Callahan worked in shadows, in paperwork, in the slow strangulation of legal threats. But the weight of the gun was reassuring, a tether to a time when threats were at least honest enough to show themselves. Scout laid his head on Ethan's boot, a silent communion between two beings who understood that loyalty sometimes meant standing guard in the dark. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ear, feeling the coarse gray hairs that had gradually replaced the sleek black coat of youth. The night sky stretched endless above the trees, stars piercing through gaps in the cloud cover like distant flares. Somewhere in this valley, people had screamed, and no one had come. Children had scratched their names into wood, hoping someone would remember them. Ethan would not forget. Not again. Not like Fallujah, where he'd been too slow, too cautious, where his hesitation had cost lives. This time the dead would have a voice. This time he would make sure someone listened. The emailed documents burned in his mind, fragments of official language masking atrocities. The landslide hadn't been natural. The sawmill death hadn't been an accident. Judge Harlan's signature on those cover-ups connected past to present. The grandfather of the current district attorney, the father of the town council president. Blood and power flowing through generations. Ethan traced mental lines between the names, the dates, the properties. Something larger than one company, one town, was at play. The federal seal on that map wasn't just bureaucracy, it was authorization. Someone high up had given Ravenon logging license to operate beyond the law in the name of national interest. And if that was true, then the enemies he faced weren't just local. They had connections that reached beyond county lines, perhaps all the way to Washington. That thought should have terrified him. Instead, it hardened his resolve. The bigger the lie, the more important the truth became. Scout's head suddenly lifted, ears perking forward. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest, a warning vibration Ethan felt through his boot. Ethan tensed, hand tightening on the rifle, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved in the darkness, but Scout's alert was never wrong. Then he heard it, a soft rustling beyond the clearing, too deliberate to be wind, too cautious to be wildlife. Someone was watching. Scout rose slowly, hackles raised, but Ethan placed a hand on his back. "Stay," he whispered. "Let them look. Let them worry." Whoever lurked in the shadows tonight was gathering information, assessing threat. Ethan wanted them to see him armed, alert, unafraid. Let them report back that the crazy Marine wasn't going to be intimidated. The minutes stretched long and taut. Eventually the rustling faded. Scout relaxed slightly but remained vigilant. Ethan never doubted someone had been there. In a town built on secrets, surveillance was as natural as breathing. This was only the beginning. They would come with offers next, or with more creative threats. Then, if he still didn't bend, they would come with force disguised as law. The playbook was old but effective. Ethan watched the mist swirl around the distant pines, thinking of the 7 IDs in his pack. 7 lives erased, 7 families left without answers, 7 threads in a tapestry of corruption that had smothered this valley for generations. He was just one broken man with a day, a cabin, and evidence no one wanted to see. But sometimes that was enough to tear open the darkness. Sometimes the truth needed just one voice, one witness, one person stubborn enough to stand when others knelt. The waterfall thundered in the distance, constant and indifferent. Ethan listened to its roar and thought of the souls it had swallowed, the secrets it had kept. Water shaped stone through persistence, not strength. Perhaps that was his path forward, not confrontation but erosion. Steady, patient, unstoppable. Scout settled back at his feet, a warm presence in the cold night. The weight of discovery sat heavy on Ethan's shoulders, but for the first time in years, he felt something like purpose, burning through the fog of isolation. The dead had chosen him as their witness. He would not let them down. Tomorrow would bring new strategies, new dangers, but tonight, under stars that had watched civilizations rise and fall, Ethan Rollins made a silent promise to those forgotten beneath Ravenon Falls. Your names will be spoken again. Your truth will be known, and those who silenced you will finally answer for their crimes. The war he'd fought overseas had left him broken, but this war for memory, for justice, for the voiceless, might just make him whole again. Dawn broke across Ravenon with mist clinging to the pines, the scent of coming rain heavy in the air. 3 days had passed since Sheriff Callahan's threat, and Ethan had spent them in a state of hypervigilance, sleeping in short bursts, keeping Scout close. He'd hidden copies of the evidence in multiple locations, one set buried in a waterproof case near the fallen oak at the property's edge, another sealed in the hollow space beneath his cabin's floorboards, a third tucked into his old service rucksack, ready to move. The morning had a stillness that felt deceptive, like the pause before an ambush. Scout's behavior had changed since their discovery, the dog growing more alert, more protective. Even now, as Ethan nursed a cup of bitter coffee on the porch steps, Scout paced the perimeter, stopping occasionally to stare toward the waterfall with ears pricked forward. Ethan watched him, noting the unusual focus. In their years together, he'd learned to trust the dog's instincts more than his own. Scout had sensed the tunnel before they found it. Maybe he sensed something else now. The dog stopped suddenly near the base of the falls where the white water thundered into the gorge. He stood motionless, then gave a single sharp bark, the same alert that had led them to the hidden entrance days before. Ethan set his mug down and followed, limping across the uneven ground as fast as his damaged knee would allow. The spray from the falls created a perpetual veil of mist, freezing the rocks into a treacherous sheet of ice each morning before the sun climbed high enough to melt it. Scout remained fixed in position, pawing at something half buried in stone. Ethan approached cautiously, scanning the tree line before crouching beside the dog. What he initially took for a blackened wooden column, half buried in stone, revealed itself as something more deliberate upon closer inspection. The wood was charred, as if it had once burned, then been extinguished by decades of spray from the falls. Scout pawed at it at base, then backed up, eyes fixed on Ethan with that unnerving intelligence that sometimes made him wonder who was actually in charge of their partnership. "All right, let's see," Ethan muttered. He brushed away moss and splintered wood until his fingers struck something metallic wedged deep in the crevice. He pried it loose, confusion growing as he examined the object. It wasn't wood at all. Not entirely. It was casing, a camera, a waterproof housing, corroded but remarkably intact, bolted into the rock as if someone had hidden it there to watch, or to guard. His stomach knotted. Cameras didn't just end up sealed behind scorched beams under a waterfall. Someone had put it there deliberately, and someone had meant it for it to stay hidden. Inside, the waterproof housing was not a modern camera at all, but a battered Betamax camcorder, the kind manufactured in the late 70s. The metal casing was corroded, its plastic yellowed, yet a cassette still sat locked inside, reels stiff with age. Ethan examined the housing more carefully. It wasn't just any waterproof case, it was military grade, designed for extreme conditions. His unit had used similar protection for surveillance equipment in Iraq. The rubber gaskets had degraded, but they'd held long enough to protect the contents from decades of exposure. Whatever was on this tape, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve it, then tried to destroy it. He pried the tape free, dried it carefully with his shirt, then tucked it into his jacket. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Who had placed a camera here? When? And why had they tried to burn it? Back at the cabin, Ethan unpacked a digitizer rig he'd kept from his service days, equipment designed to recover data from damaged media. He'd used it overseas to salvage intelligence from devices recovered in raids. Now it might help him recover whatever secrets the waterfall had been guarding. The process was painstaking. The tape had suffered from age and moisture despite its protection, the magnetic material deteriorating at the edges. After hours of careful work, adjustments, and silent curses, the laptop screen finally flickered to life. Grainy colors bled across the display, the sound muffled but present. The date stamp in the corner read August 19th, 1981. Ethan's pulse quickened as the first images appeared. The same tunnel entrance he'd discovered, but as it had looked over 40 years ago. The stone facade was intact then, disguising the entrance completely. Two men emerged from it, each carrying a heavy sack that seemed to weigh them down, forcing an awkward gait. The bags dripped a dark liquid, staining the ground, trailing into the water. Ethan leaned forward, heart hammering against his ribs. The men moved with practiced ease, swinging the sacks once, twice, before letting them fall into the churning, white water of Ravenon Falls. Blood washed out like ink, vanishing into the current. The camera's perspective didn't move. Whoever set it had done so to capture exactly this moment, to document a crime they knew would happen again. Ethan paused the video, rewound, and froze the frame as one of the men turned just enough to show his face. Weathered, sharp-jawed, with eyes that held the same cold assurance Ethan had seen on campaign posters and plaques in Town Hall. He whispered the name before he could stop himself, Joseph Redgrave. The camera caught the glint of a heavy signet ring on Redgrave's right hand, the same Redgrave crest displayed in photographs hanging in Town Hall. The jawline, the ring, the posture left no doubt. This was the grandfather of the current mayor, Daniel Redgrave, the patriarch of Ravenon's most powerful family. Ethan sat back, the chair legs scraping across floorboards. His pulse thundered in his ears. Scout whined, sensing his reaction. Ethan reached down and scratched the dog's head with trembling fingers. The second man in the video remained half-turned, his features less clear, but Ethan captured the still anyway, zooming in until the pixels blurred. He couldn't make a positive identification, but there was something familiar in the stance, the build. Whoever it was, he had been part of it. Together they had hauled those sacks, whatever was inside them, bodies, remains, evidence, and erased them under the roar of water. Ethan played the video again, forcing himself to watch every second, to burn it into memory. Because once something like this was seen, it could never be unseen. The bags, the blood, the face of Joseph Redgrave. History carved into grainy footage no one had meant to survive. He copied the file onto 3 different drives, tucked one into his jacket pocket, another into the box where Scout's food came in, and left the last in the laptop. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just about missing townspeople anymore. This was family legacy, stitched into the very fabric of Ravenon's power structure. The Redgraves had ruled this town for nearly a century through money, logging, politics. And now Ethan had in his hands proof that the foundation of that dynasty had been built on blood. Scout stirred, ears pricking toward the door as though he'd heard something outside. Ethan shut the laptop, heart still racing, and felt the weight of the flash drive in his pocket. It burned like a brand against his chest. The night was colder than usual, a brittle kind of cold that worked through wood and bone alike. Ethan had stayed awake long after midnight, the video file still replaying in his head, every grainy image etched like fire. Joseph Redgrave dumping sacks of bloodied evidence into Ravenon Falls was now more than just proof. It was a curse he couldn't put back in the box. Scout lay by the hearth, ribs rising and falling slow, but his ears twitched with each shift of the wind outside. Ethan stared at the flash drive on the table, the glow of the fire painting it like an ember. His gut told him he was sitting on borrowed time. He finally drifted into uneasy sleep, the kind of shallow rest where every shadow might still be a threat. The first sound he heard wasn't breaking glass or footsteps. It was Scout's howl, a piercing, urgent sound that tore through the night like a siren. Ethan bolted upright as the smell hit him. Smoke, acrid and thick, bleeding through the cabin seams. He lunged from bed, coughing, eyes stinging. Scout was at the door, paws slamming against it, howling again, demanding Ethan move. Flames licked under the window frame, spreading fast, the old timber cabin hissing as if it had been waiting decades to burn. Ethan grabbed his pack, shoved the flash drive into it, and staggered toward the door. The second he reached for the latch, the door shuddered from an impact. Not fire, a strike. Scout snarled, then let out a sharp yelp that froze Ethan's blood. He threw the door open, just in time to see a dark figure swinging a shovel. It connected with Scout's side, the crack of bones sharp and sickening. Scout went down hard, a sound between a growl and a gasp ripping from his throat. Ethan roared, grabbed the attacker by the collar, and slammed him against the doorframe. The man shoved back, face hidden beneath a ski mask, the stink of accelerant heavy on his clothes. Before Ethan could land another blow, the man twisted free, sprinted into the darkness, and vanished into the trees, leaving only the hiss of kerosene and the roar of flames behind. Ethan dropped to his knees beside Scout. The dog's breathing was ragged, shallow, his flank already swelling. Ethan pressed trembling hands against his fur, whispering hoarse words. "Stay with me, boy. Just stay." The fire surged, smoke filling his lungs. He scooped Scout into his arms, muscles screaming as he carried 80 pounds of injured loyalty out the door. The night outside glared red, firelight reflecting off the trees like the whole forest had turned into an execution ground. Ethan stumbled down the slope. Scout pressed to his chest, coughing, blinded by heat. When he reached the tree line, he paused, gasping for air. And that's when he saw it. On the bark of the massive oak that loomed just beyond his cabin clearing, a fresh mark glistened in the firelight, a crude X painted in wet, dark red blood. Later, under the faint beam of his flashlight, Ethan noticed the texture, thicker than paint, fresh enough to smear. He couldn't tell if it was human or animal, but the stink of copper said the message was real enough. It hadn't been there before. The mark bled down the grooves of the bark like a wound. Ethan's chest clenched. He knew what it meant. That oak had history. It had been mentioned in whispers and scraps of testimony in the missing person reports he'd dug through. People spoke of a hanging tree used long ago on company land to silence dissenters, though no official record survived. Standing there now, Ethan realized the mark wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. They were reminding him of where people went when they spoke too loudly. They were tying his life to every name he'd found in the tunnel. He tightened his grip on Scout, who whimpered, then pressed his muzzle against Ethan's chest as if anchoring him to the present. Ethan staggered further from the blaze, each breath a ragged cut through his lungs. He looked back once, the cabin fully engulfed, flames tearing through the roof with a roar that drowned even the waterfall. His home was gone. Every trace of the life he'd tried to build, every reminder of his late father, every piece of quiet he'd carved for himself, turned to ash in minutes. But he still had what mattered: Scout, the evidence, and a will hardened by fire. Scout stirred weakly in his arms, his breath uneven. "Hold on," Ethan whispered, forcing his legs forward, his body moving on muscle memory from war zones. "Carry the wounded. Get them out. Don't stop." The fire cast long shadows across the clearing, and the red X on the oak glared through the smoke, seared into Ethan's mind as much as the burns on his arms. He didn't need to be told twice. They weren't just threatening him now. They were hunting him. Ethan had spent the dawn hours tending to Scout, wrapping his ribs as carefully as he could, with what little medical supplies he kept from his service days. The dog lay curled on a blanket in the back of Ethan's truck, sides heaving with each breath, eyes duller than Ethan could bear. He wanted to drive him straight to the nearest vet, but Callahan's cruiser had been seen too many times outside the clinic in town, and he couldn't risk Scout being taken as leverage. Instead, he headed southeast toward Butler County, where an old war buddy ran a small animal hospital that wouldn't ask questions. Mike Torres had been a combat medic in their unit, now a veterinarian who understood that some injuries came with stories better left untold. His practiced hands examined Scout gently, confirming 3 broken ribs and substantial bruising, but thankfully no punctured lung or internal bleeding. Torres hadn't asked about the burns on Ethan's arms or the haunted look in his eyes, just treated them both and offered his office's back room as temporary shelter. It wasn't charity. They'd saved each other too many times overseas for that. It was the unspoken bond of men who'd seen things they couldn't explain to those who hadn't been there. Let him rest here a few days, Torres advised, cleaning his hands at the sink. I've got space, and no one's looking for you here. Ethan nodded, gratitude catching in his throat. Scout would be safe, monitored, cared for. It gave him freedom to move, to act, and he knew exactly where he needed to go next. By late morning, Ethan drove into town, his truck carrying the smell of smoke in its upholstery. His face was set in a mask that made the few townsfolk on Main Street glance once and look away fast. Word of the fire had spread, but no one asked questions. No one ever did in Ravenon. Ethan parked outside the small nursing home on the edge of town, a brick building with faded shutters that smelled faintly of bleach and boiled vegetables. He hadn't come here by chance. The name Margaret Holt from the IDs haunted him. But there had been another name whispered once in his father's stories. Eliza Caraway, the only one who'd ever made it out alive. He didn't know if she was still breathing, but a query at the front desk confirmed his hope. Miss Caraway's in room 12. Don't upset her. The nurse's tone suggested this was a standard warning, not specific to Ethan's visit. He walked down the narrow hall, the smell of antiseptic growing stronger with each step. The door to room 12 was partially open. Ethan knocked softly, then entered. A tiny figure sat in a rocking chair by the window, frame swallowed in a patchwork shawl. Her hair was white and wispy, her face a map of time, but her eyes, startlingly sharp, pale blue, fixed on him the second he entered. You've been where you shouldn't. Her voice was thin but steady, almost accusatory. Ethan froze, the air shifting heavy around him. Excuse me? She nodded once, her hands trembling slightly on the armrests. The tunnel, the hooks, the children. You saw it. Ethan swallowed hard. How could you possibly know? She closed her eyes, the lids quivering as if holding back storms. Because I was there. I was 17 when they took me. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He stepped closer, lowering himself onto the edge of the bed across from her chair. Eliza's gaze drifted to the window, then back to him, as if assessing whether he was worthy of her story. I heard they burned you out last night. News travels fast here, even to those they think have forgotten. Her fingers brushed her lips absently, as though remembering a sensation. When they shackled us, I passed out. I thought I'd never wake, but then something wet touched my hand. A tongue, gentle, insistent. A dog had slipped into the chamber somehow. He licked the blood from my wrist, kept me awake, kept me alive long enough to hear the shift change and slip free. Her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. If it hadn't been for that dog, I'd be bones under that waterfall. Ethan's throat tightened, words caught somewhere between disbelief and reverence. He crouched down so his eyes met hers. You're saying there's been more than one? That this has happened before? She nodded, slow and deliberate. Ravenon Logging didn't just steal land. They stole lives. They called it transfer. We called it hell. Your cabin by the falls. All of it was their holding site, a place for anyone who refused to sell. I saw farmers, mothers, even children dragged through those tunnels. They broke us with fear, then with silence. And if silence failed, they buried us where no one would look. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. They told me no one would believe me if I ever spoke. They were right. I tried once in '54. The sheriff then laughed me out of the station. So I stayed quiet, lived with ghosts. She leaned forward, her frail hand trembling as it reached toward him. Her palm was cool and paper-thin against his scarred knuckles. And now here you are. And they'll try to make you disappear too. Ethan clenched his jaw, the image of the bloodied X on the oak searing against her words. Why now? Why are they coming after me? Eliza's gaze sharpened. Because you dug up what they spent generations burying, and they can't bury it again unless they bury you with it. They'll come at you from all sides. Legal threats, character assassination, violence disguised as accident. That's always been their way. She reached under her shawl and pulled out a worn leather notebook, its cover cracked with age. This was my father's. He documented everything before they took him. Property lines, water rights, the original deeds. The real maps, not the ones they filed after. I've kept it safe all these years, waiting. She pressed it into his hands. Take it. Use it. Ethan accepted the notebook, the weight of it surprising for something so small. Inside, meticulous handwritten notes detailed boundary disputes, water access rights, and allegations of forged deeds, all dating back to the 1940s. She'd been guarding this evidence for 70 years, waiting for someone willing to listen. No one believed an old woman, she continued, but you have something didn't. Proof they can't ignore. Her fingers gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Make them remember us. Make them say our names again. Ethan nodded, tucking the notebook into his jacket. I found a video from 1981. Joseph Redgrave and another man dumping something in the falls, something that left blood in the water. Eliza's expression hardened. Joseph Redgrave, the devil himself. His grandson Daniel is cut from the same cloth. Power passing to power, blood passing to blood. Breaking that lineage of cruelty might be the only way to set this town free. Ethan left the nursing home with Eliza's words ringing in his ears, the weight of her confession heavier than the pack on his back. The world outside looked unchanged. Frost on the sidewalks, children chasing each other across a yard, cars coughing smoke into the air. But for him, nothing would ever be the same. He drove to a motel 30 miles outside town, one of those anonymous roadside establishments that catered to travelers who needed to disappear for a night. The room was basic but clean, with decent Wi-Fi, all he needed for the next step. Ethan spent hours compiling the evidence, the IDs from the tunnel, the federal map, scans of Eliza's notebook, and most damning of all, the video footage. He recorded himself on the laptop's camera, recounting what he'd seen and what Eliza had told him. His voice remained steady even as he described the tunnel, the shackles, the children's handprints. Years of military discipline had taught him how to report horror without flinching. When he finished, he packaged it all together and sent it to a freelance investigative journalist he'd met years ago in Denver, a woman named Riley Monroe who had built a reputation for chasing stories no one else would touch. Her work exposing corruption in small-town politics had won awards and made enemies in equal measure. Ethan trusted her more than anyone in Ravenon. The message he attached was brief. This is happening in Ravenon, Oregon. These people were real. I have the proof. Please help make sure their names are remembered. Hours passed. He dozed in the uncomfortable chair, the burner phone he'd purchased on the way lying silent on the table. Then it buzzed with a notification. Riley had gone live. Ethan clicked the link. On his screen, Riley sat in her cluttered office, eyes blazing as she introduced the footage. She showed the tunnel, the IDs, the federal stamped map. She played the 1981 video, her voice tight as she froze the frame on Joseph Redgrave's face. And then she cut to Ethan's recorded testimony, his words raw and unpolished, his scarred face unflinching as he said, "They murdered people to steal land. They buried them under my feet, and they tried to burn me alive to keep me quiet." For 20 minutes, the broadcast streamed uninterrupted, comments pouring in, outrage spreading. But then, just as Riley's voice grew more urgent, laying out the connections between past disappearances and current town leadership, the feed froze. The screen went black. A system message appeared. This channel has been terminated for misinformation. Ethan swore under his breath, slamming the desk with his fist. He refreshed the page. Nothing. Riley's entire archive was gone, her name erased like it had never existed. He called her cell. No answer. He tried again. Straight to voicemail. A chill spread through him, colder than the night air. They had silenced her quicker than he thought possible, with a reach that extended far beyond Ravenon's borders. This wasn't just a corrupt town, it was a system, with connections in places high enough pushed to terminate a prominent journalist's entire online presence within minutes. Ethan sat there, rage chewing through his chest, when another notification lit the screen. This time it was a message from an anonymous account. No name, no picture, just a black icon with a single word. Wait, a link followed. Ethan hesitated, then clicked. The screen opened onto a dark web stream, the kind of back-channel feed built for whistleblowers and fugitives. And there it was, Riley's broadcast replaying in full, but this time under a header that read, "Truth that cannot be buried." The comment section flew faster than Ethan could read. Thousands of people tuning in, then tens of thousands. By nightfall, the viewer count topped 1 million. Clips spread like wildfire across forums and encrypted apps. People demanded answers. Activists shared the names from the IDs. Families of the missing spoke out. College students from across the state began organizing rallies. Hashtags trended overnight. Ravenon blood, silent no more, red grave, cover up. Ethan watched it unfold from his motel room, numb with shock at how fast the tide had turned. He had expected silence, dismissal, maybe a headline buried on page 6. Instead, he was watching an entire state catch fire with fury. But the euphoria was short-lived. For every post demanding justice, another appeared denouncing the video as fake, accusing Ethan of fabrication, calling him unstable, a disgraced veteran chasing ghosts. Trolls flooded the feeds. Bots spouted propaganda about Ravenon logging being a pillar of American prosperity. The battle lines were drawn in pixels and voices, and Ethan knew exactly which side had more money, more reach, more muscle. Still, the dark web feed wouldn't go down. Whoever had uploaded it was running servers outside the country, untouchable by the same censors that had silenced Riley. Ethan tried messaging the anonymous account. "Who are you?" No reply came for hours. Then just as dawn broke, a single message appeared. "Keep going." He stared at the words until they blurred, then closed the laptop. Whoever his ally was, they remained in the shadows, helping but not revealing themselves. In a town built on secrets, perhaps that was the only safe way to operate. Ethan checked out of the motel and drove back to Tora's clinic. Scout was awake when he arrived, eyes brightening as Ethan entered, tail giving a weak thump against the blankets. The reunion pierced something in Ethan's chest, a reminder that in all this darkness, some connections remained unbroken. Torres offered his spare room above the clinic, a simple space with a bed and a desk. "It's yours as long as you need it. Nobody's looking for you here." Ethan accepted with a nod. He needed a base of operations, somewhere to monitor the fallout and plan his next move. Scout needed time to heal, and Ethan needed allies. Torres was just the first. The firestorm of outrage didn't stay online. Within a week, volunteers, journalists, and independent researchers started pouring into Ravenon despite threats from local officials. Ethan watched them arrive with a mixture of disbelief and unease. For years, the town had looked at him as a ghost, an embarrassment, a broken soldier who muttered at shadows. Now, camera crews parked on Main Street. Students camped in church basements. Professors from state universities requested access to the site under the falls. Sheriff Callahan tried to shut it down, stationing deputies at the tree line, but every move he made only deepened suspicion. His press conferences dismissing conspiracy theories were cut with clips of the tunnel, the shackles, the blood-stained hooks. The mayor's office issued statements about disgruntled individuals seeking attention and unsubstantiated claims, but they rang hollow against the physical evidence emerging daily. Each denial seemed to fuel more interest, more scrutiny. In the end, under mounting pressure, the state reluctantly allowed an independent archaeological survey under the guise of preserving historical property. Ethan knew what that really meant. They wanted to control the narrative. But the narrative was no longer theirs to write. He kept his distance initially, monitoring from Torres' clinic as Scout's ribs slowly healed. The dog slept more than usual, but his eyes were clear, his appetite returning. The attack had aged him, silver hairs spreading faster across his muzzle, but the loyal heart remained strong. When Ethan finally ventured back to the falls, it was under the protection of a crowd. A team of archaeologists led by Dr. Orr. Hannah Whitaker had established a perimeter around the site, complete with security cameras and volunteers standing guard in shifts. Dr. Whitaker herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who shook Ethan's hand firmly when he approached. "You've already done the hardest part. Now, let us do ours." Scout sat stiff by Ethan's side, ribs still mending, gaze never leaving the strangers swarming over what had once been their private domain. Ethan wasn't sure whether to feel relief or dread as ground-penetrating radar, drones, and cameras were deployed across the area. The waterfall thundered as though it had seen this all before. decades of secrets washing away, only to resurface when the time was right. 2 days into the dig, the first chamber gave way. Wooden beams collapsed under careful removal, revealing a cavity deeper than Ethan had ever dared to explore alone. The stench that rose from it was unmistakable, a cocktail of rot, iron, and time. Protective masks went on. Floodlights snapped alive, and silence fell as the first bones came into view. 3 sets, each collapsed in unnatural positions, half consumed by the earth. But what seized Ethan's breath wasn't just the bones. It was the details that clung to them. On one skeleton still rested a shoe, the leather cracked but intact, sole stamped with a brand discontinued in 1973. Another had a rusted brass union badge pinned to the tatters of fabric, the letters still faint but clear enough to read, Ruth Barker. Ethan's knees weakened. He whispered the name as if summoning a ghost, remembering it from the stack of IDs. A third skeleton clutched something metallic against its ribs. When pried loose, it revealed itself as a military-style tag, corroded but legible. Lewis Quinn. The team documented each find with solemn precision, but Ethan could feel the air in the chamber change. The silence wasn't just scientific. It was reverence, the kind of reverence that acknowledged these were not artifacts, but people whose voices had been ripped away. As the light shifted, something else caught the beam. Small bones scattered in the corner, not aligned with the human remains. The archaeologist crouched, brushed gently, then froze. "This isn't human," she murmured. Ethan stepped forward, his throat dry. The bones were canine, a rib cage, a jaw, teeth still sharp, a collar fused into rust. Ethan's breath hitched. Scout, the living one at his side, whined as though recognizing kin. Ethan crouched, trembling fingers brushing the dirt. The archaeologist lifted the corroded collar and revealed a small plate, still legible beneath the grime. The tag bore only one word, stamped deep enough to survive the decades. Scout. Ethan felt his chest collapse inward. It wasn't possible. Hours later, deeper in the chamber, another object emerged from the soil. A medal, dulled but still gleaming under floodlight. Its engraving read, "To Scout for Bravery Under Fire, 1945. Dr. Whitaker later confirmed that quartermaster records for that medal still existed in declassified files, tying it to a war dog assigned to a Pacific unit in 1945. Ethan's vision blurred, heart slamming against his ribs, the name echoing. The same name. He'd read about war dogs, the way soldiers had relied on them for survival in the most desperate conditions. And now, in this place, beneath this cursed waterfall, lay the bones of one such animal. A dog once called Scout. A dog honored for valor, discarded like the people it had tried to protect. Ethan staggered back, chest heaving. He looked down at his Scout, alive but wounded, gazing up at him with trusting eyes. The coincidence was too sharp, too cruel. Different decades, different wars, the same name, the same loyalty. History repeating itself not in books, but in blood and bone. Dr. Whitaker touched his shoulder, her voice gentle but steady. "These people didn't just vanish, Mr. Rollins. They were erased. What you found, it proves everything." Ethan said nothing, staring at the metal in his hand, the weight of it heavier than any rifle he'd ever carried. The air smelled of dust and finality, but beneath it ran a current of rage, silent and rising. Scout pressed against his leg, ribs shuddering, eyes glinting in the light. Ethan knelt and whispered words meant only for the dog, but they carried in the quiet chamber. "They had a Scout then, and I've got a Scout now, and neither of you were ever meant to be forgotten." The waterfall thundered above, as though bearing witness, its spray seeping through stone, its roar the only eulogy these bones had ever been given. The discovery of the remains beneath Ravenon Falls became the breaking point. Within 48 hours, satellite trucks and state officials crowded the valley, their tents and equipment turning Ethan's quiet exile into a battlefield of microphones and subpoenas. The images circulated nationally: rusted shackles, children's handprints etched into stone, and the bones of both humans and a war dog. It was no longer rumor or folklore. It was evidence, undeniable and damning. Ethan stood back from the press line, Scout pressed against his leg, ribs still bound, while Dr. Whitaker's team released preliminary findings. Her voice carried over the hum of cameras. We have confirmed this site was used unlawfully for the detention and likely execution of civilians between 1947 and 1982. The documents recovered, paired with physical remains, connect directly to Ravenon Logging Company and, by extension, municipal authorities who sanctioned their actions. The governor's office announced a special investigation that same evening. By dawn, the words "crimes of land" and "silence" were on every broadcast. Sheriff Callahan was the first to fall, led from his office in handcuffs as reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. His smug mask was gone, his eyes small and cornered like an animal that suddenly realizes the trap has sprung. Hours later, Mayor Daniel Redgrave gave a defiant speech denying everything. But his words were drowned out when the footage of his grandfather dumping sacks of blood-soaked evidence played side by side with his own face on split screens across the country. The family resemblance was striking. The same jaw, the same cold eyes, the same signet ring glinting on his right hand. Within a week, he too was indicted, along with two councilmen who had signed false land transfer papers in the 1970s. 4 men in power, stripped bare. Their names now linked not to progress or prosperity, but to murder and cover-up. The Redgrave dynasty, built on bones, was crumbling before the town's eyes. Anonymous leaks continued. Records showing land transfers immediately following disappearances. Internal memos about problem residents who later vanished. A web of corruption spanning generations, connecting Ravenon logging to law enforcement, local government, even federal agencies that had turned blind eyes in the name of timber production deemed vital to national interests. Ethan watched the news unfold, not with triumph, but with a heaviness he couldn't shake. Justice, at least on paper, was moving, but it had taken decades. Too many years of silence, too many lives lost, too many voices buried beneath the roar of water. He returned to Torres's clinic each night, where Scout waited, improving slowly but visibly weaker than before the attack. The dog had always been old, 11 when they met, over 15 now, but the beating had accelerated his decline. His eyes remained bright and alert, but his body was betraying him day by day. "It's the ribs," Torres explained one evening, voice low. "They're healing, but the trauma at his age, it's asking a lot. His heart's working overtime." Ethan nodded, something cold and final settling in his chest. He'd seen it before, in men who survived the initial blast only to fade weeks later. The body could only absorb so much violence before it surrendered, regardless of the spirit inside. Each night, Ethan sat beside Scout's bed on the floor of Torres's spare room, one hand resting on the dog's flank, feeling the rhythm of breath, the steady but gradually slowing beat of his heart. He told Scout stories about the other Scout whose bones they had found, about the people whose names would now be remembered, about the town that was finally facing its ghosts. In those quiet hours, Ethan realized something he'd been missing in the chaos of exposure and revelation. This had never been about him. It had always been about them. The forgotten ones, the erased ones, the ones who screamed when no one came. He had simply been the vessel, the voice they'd been waiting for. Scout had led him to that truth, just as another Scout had led Eliza to freedom decades ago. Dogs seeing what humans missed, loyalty outlasting time itself. The night the indictments were announced, Scout collapsed by the fire. His body gave out quietly, without drama, his head resting against Ethan's boot, as though he had simply decided his work was finished. Ethan tried everything, his hands pressing, his voice urging, but he knew the look in Scout's eyes. A slow, grateful fade. The dog that had carried him through nightmares, through fire, through truth itself, was gone. "I'm sorry," Torres whispered from the doorway. He was a hell of a dog. Ethan didn't respond. He gathered Scout into his arms one last time, the body still warm but emptied of the spirit that had made it his companion. In that moment, all the justice in the world felt hollow against this single personal loss. They buried Scout 2 days later by the falls, in soil that had given and taken so much. The townspeople came, not all, but enough to matter. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Ethan now stood shoulder to shoulder, some holding candles, others nothing but silence. For the first time since returning from Iraq, Ethan didn't feel invisible. He lowered Scout into the ground with his own hands, every shovel full of dirt, both an ending and a beginning. When the grave was finished, he set a stone marker, rough-hewn but solid, the kind that wouldn't vanish with time. He had carved into it himself the night before, his hands blistered but steady. The words were simple. They called him a dog. But he opened what history tried to bury. He spoke them aloud now, his voice low but carrying across the gathered crowd. For a moment, no one moved, the only sound the eternal roar of Ravenon Falls. The silence stretched heavy and absolute. Then from the back, a single clap echoed. Another followed and another until the whole gathering rose in applause, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. For the dumb, for the truth, for the man who had refused to let silence win. 2 weeks after Scout's burial, Ravenon had transformed beyond recognition. State police had established a command center in the vacant hardware store on Main Street. Forensic teams worked round the clock at the falls, carefully excavating chambers that extended deeper than anyone had imagined. Each day brought new discoveries, more remains, more evidence, more connections between the dead and those who still wielded power. The applause at Scout's funeral still echoed in Ethan's mind as he drove through town. For the first time since returning from Iraq, he wasn't invisible to these people. But recognition brought responsibilities he hadn't sought, becoming the reluctant center of a storm he'd only meant to witness. Dr. Hannah Whitaker's preliminary report confirmed what Ethan had uncovered. The tunnel system had served as a detention facility from approximately 1947 to 1982, holding an estimated 20 to 30 individuals. Carbon dating and forensic analysis matched several sets of remains to the missing persons in the laminated IDs. Most damning were the military-grade shackles, the structural reinforcements, and the careful concealment of the entrance. This was no makeshift operation, but a deliberately designed facility, maintained for decades, then methodically hidden when its usefulness ended. The state attorney general appointed a special prosecutor. Grand juries convened. Subpoenas landed on desks of town officials, former Ravenon logging executives, and federal agencies that had overseen timber contracts during the post-war boom. Ethan watched from a careful distance. He'd given his sworn testimony, handed over all evidence, identified locations, and then stepped back. This phase of justice belonged to the living victims, families who'd been told their loved ones had simply run away, children who'd grown up with holes in their family trees, elders like Eliza who'd carried the truth alone for decades. He found temporary housing in a cabin owned by one of Torres's clients, a retired teacher who spent winters in Arizona. It sat on the opposite side of town from his burned home with no view of the falls. The silence felt strange after years of constant water sound, but he was adapting, learning to hear the world without that perpetual roar. Each morning he woke reaching for Scout, the phantom presence strong enough to jolt him fully awake. The absence hit anew daily. Grief was nothing unfamiliar. He'd lost men under his command, lost his father to cancer, lost parts of himself in Fallujah, but this cut differently. Scout had been his constant, the one being who'd seen him at his worst and stayed anyway. A month after the funeral, his phone rang. The burner he'd purchased still his only connection to the outside world. The voice belonged to Riley Monroe, the journalist who'd first broken the story before her channel was taken down. "I'm back online," she began without preamble. "Whoever tried to bury the story couldn't keep me off the air for long. My legal team is filing suit against the platform for wrongful termination. But that's not why I'm calling. I need to talk to you about what we found in the Army Corps of Engineers archives. They met at a diner halfway between Ravenon and Portland, neutral ground where neither was likely to be recognized. Riley looked different in person, smaller, sharper, with eyes that missed nothing, and a notebook already open before she sat down. The Corps sealed most of their records from that period," she explained, sliding a folder across the table. "But my team found a gap in the classification. Someone forgot to redact a series of internal memos about specialized detention facilities authorized under Executive Order 9547. Ethan flipped through the documents, military language jumping out at him. Words like containment, extraction, and denial operations. Cold War terminology for very dark operations. "We always thought this was just about timber rights and land grabs," Riley continued, her coffee untouched. "It was bigger. The government was using private companies as cover for political detentions during the Red Scare. Ravenon Logging got federal contracts in exchange for housing persons of interest, suspected communists, labor organizers, environmental activists, people who threatened the established order. That explains the federal stamp on the map, Ethan said, studying a memo authorizing temporary holding structures on land controlled by timber companies across the Pacific Northwest. But some of those people were just farmers who wouldn't sell their land. Children even. Riley's expression hardened. Mission creep. Once Ravenon Logging realized they had federal protection to detain people without consequences, they expanded the operation to serve their business interests. The government looked the other way because they needed the timber. Symbiotic corruption. She tapped the folder. These memos prove federal complicity, not just the town, not just the company. This goes all the way up, or at least it did. The implications hung in the diner's stale air. This wasn't just a local crime, but systemic, sanctioned at the highest levels, with roots that reached into the present day. I'm testifying before a congressional committee next month, Riley said. These documents will be entered into the record. Your name will come up. You're the one who found the physical evidence that makes these paper trails matter. Are you ready for that level of exposure? Ethan considered the question. He'd been a ghost in Ravenon for so long, defined by what he'd lost rather than what he'd found. Now his name would be linked forever to this case, to these revelations. There would be no going back to anonymity. The dead deserve witnesses, he said finally. I can handle the rest. Riley nodded, satisfaction flickering across her features. She'd been right to trust him with the story. Not everyone would have carried it through when the threats began. There's something else, she added, pulling a final document from her bag. This was found in Joseph Redgrave's personal files when they searched his grandson's home. It's a list of names, people they were watching, people they considered threats. Ethan scanned the yellowed paper. 37 names neatly typed, each with a date beside it. Some he recognized from the IDs in the tunnel. Others were unfamiliar. But the final entry made his blood run cold. John Rollins, 1984. Marked deferred. John Rollins, his father. The memory surfaced like a bubble breaking through dark water. His father arguing with men in suits at their kitchen table. Talk of water rights, creek access, strange chemical smells downstream from the logging operation. He must have been 7 or 8, watching through the cracked door as his father refused to sign something. They had been watching his family, planning his father's disappearance. The only reason it hadn't happened was the cancer that took him in 1980. Deferred became unnecessary when nature did their work for them. Ethan closed the folder, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. So this was never random. I was marked before I ever found that tunnel. The ghost of your father was enough to put you on their radar, Riley confirmed. When you bought that cabin by the falls, land nobody else would touch because of the accidents that kept happening there, they started watching you more closely. Sheriff Callahan's files show increased surveillance on your property starting around 2017. Ethan absorbed this information with a soldier's detachment. It explained the town's reaction to him from the beginning. Not just a broken veteran, but the son of a man who'd almost joined the disappeared. What he couldn't explain was why he'd been drawn to that specific piece of land when he returned from Iraq. Something about the roar of the falls, the isolation, the feeling of being simultaneously hidden and exposed. Had some part of him sensed what lay beneath the stone? Had he been unconsciously finishing what his father had started? Does it matter? Riley asked, reading his expression. You found it. You did what no one else had the courage to do for 70 years. The why is less important than what happens next. She was right. Motivation was a luxury compared to action. Keep these safe, Ethan said, sliding the folder back across the table. Make sure they see the light. Before they parted, Riley handed him a business card with a number scrawled on the back. Your anonymous helper, the one who kept the broadcast going after my channel went down. He wants to meet you. Says he has more. 2 days later, Ethan found himself at the modest ranch house of Arnold Weiss, former chief archivist for Ravenon County. At 78, Weiss had spent most of his career meticulously preserving records that others wanted destroyed. His home was filled with filing cabinets, boxes, and carefully organized binders, a personal archive of documents smuggled out over decades. I knew they were destroying records, Weiss explained, arthritis-gnarled fingers tracing a ledger from 1953. Every time a case came up involving the company, files would disappear. So I started making copies, creating redundancy. He'd been watching the pattern for 50 years, land transfers following disappearances, death certificates with questionable causes, property records altered and refiled. None of it was smoking gun evidence on its own, but together it formed a constellation of corruption pointing directly at Ravenon Logging and its political allies. When I saw your footage online, I knew it was time, Weiss continued. I'd been waiting for physical proof to match these paper trails. You found it. He'd been the one to upload Riley's broadcast to secure servers after it was taken down, the one who'd messaged Ethan to keep going. A silent guardian of truth working from the shadows of bureaucracy. Weiss handed over a thumb drive containing scans of everything he'd preserved, thousands of documents spanning 7 decades. This isn't just about the people who disappeared. It's about what happened to their land afterward. The pattern, once seen, was unmistakable. Ravenon Logging had systematically identified properties controlling key water access points throughout the county. When owners refused to sell, they became problems to be solved. After they vanished, their lands were acquired through rigged auctions, probate manipulation, or forged signatures on transfer deeds. But the most valuable acquisitions weren't for timber at all. They were for what lay beneath the forest floor. This whole valley sits on one of the largest undeveloped copper deposits in the country, Weiss revealed, unfolding a geological survey map from 1942. The original discovery was classified during the war, copper being essential for ammunition production. After 1945, the information was supposed to be released, but someone made sure it stayed buried. Instead, Ravenon Logging spent 40 years acquiring surface rights to key properties, positioning themselves to control access to the mineral wealth below. The timber business was profitable, but also cover for a much larger game. They're sitting on billions, Weiss said, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right political climate to start extraction. That's why they fought so hard to keep the tunnel hidden. It's not just about the murders, it's about the motive. Expose that, and the whole empire collapses. Weiss pulled out another folder, this one containing news clippings about environmental protests in the 1970s. The most vocal opponents were among the disappeared. Clara Ellis had organized protests against water pollution. Frank Hensley had tried to unite local farmers against the company. Ruth Barker had been documenting health issues in children living downstream from logging operations. It wasn't just about land, Weiss emphasized. It was about anyone who might expose what they were doing to the environment, to the water. The copper deposits are laced through the aquifer system. Any extraction would risk contaminating the entire watershed for generations. They knew this. They silenced anyone who might figure it out. Ethan left Weiss's house with the thumb drive feeling heavier than its physical weight. This wasn't just about justice for the dead anymore. It was about preventing future crimes, breaking a cycle of corruption before it could claim new victims in the name of profit. That evening, he drove toward the excavation site, compelled to see how much progress had been made. The area was transformed. Floodlights, equipment, teams of workers carefully sifting through earth and stone. Yellow police tape marked off sections where remains had been found. White tents housed temporary labs for processing evidence on site. Dr. Whitaker spotted him and approached, clipboard in hand, expression grave beneath her protective helmet. "We found another chamber yesterday," she said without preamble. "Deeper than the others, better preserved." She hesitated, weighing how much to share. There were records inside, detailed accounts of interrogations, names of people who participated, guards, officials, witnesses, a complete organizational chart of who knew what and when. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just evidence of crimes, but a roadmap of complicity that would implicate dozens who thought themselves safe from discovery. "Some of these people are still alone," Whitaker continued, "still holding positions of authority, not just here, but at the state and federal level. The special prosecutor is moving them to a secure facility tonight. Too many powerful people would benefit from an accident at this site." Ethan scanned the busy excavation, understanding her concern. Fire would destroy paper records. Flooding could wash away evidence. A single act of sabotage could undo weeks of careful work. "I'll stay tonight," he offered. "Keep watch until the transfer happens." Whitaker shook her head. "We have armed security, Mr. Rollins. This isn't your responsibility anymore." But Ethan knew better. He'd started this, not by choice perhaps, but by action. The dead had chosen him as their witness. He wouldn't abandon that role until the last page was turned, the last name spoken, the last truth unearthed. Despite Whitaker's protests, Ethan positioned himself on the ridge overlooking the excavation, a vantage point with clear sightlines in all directions. The security team acknowledged his presence with professional nods. They respected his right to be there, even if they didn't understand his need to see it through. As darkness fell, the floodlights created islands of brightness against the surrounding forest. Workers moved between them like figures in a dream, carrying boxes, photographing evidence, preparing everything for transport. The waterfall continued its constant roar, indifferent to the secrets being pulled from its shadow. Ethan watched, remembering how this place had once been his refuge, where the noise of the water drowned out the noise in his head. Now it would forever be something else. A crime scene. A memorial. A reminder that silence could be both a weapon and a wound. Movement at the edge of the light caught his attention, a figure moving with purpose toward the main tent where the records were being processed. Something about the stride, the set of the shoulders, triggered Ethan's combat instincts. Wrong. Threat. He was on his feet before conscious thought caught up, body remembering what the mind sometimes forgot, the precise geometry of danger. The figure reached inside his jacket as he approached the tent. No security personnel had noticed, focused on the perimeter rather than authorized workers within it. Ethan closed the distance in seconds. The man had just withdrawn something from his jacket when Ethan hit him from behind, driving him to the ground with a force that knocked the air from both of them. A canister rolled from the man's hand, not a gun as Ethan had feared, but something potentially more destructive. A chemical incendiary device designed to burn hot enough to reduce paper to ash in seconds. The security team converged, alerted by the commotion. The would-be saboteur was quickly subdued, his face now visible in the harsh light. Ethan recognized him, a clerk from the county assessor's office, unremarkable in every way except for his presence here with destruction in mind. "Just following orders," the man mumbled as they led him away. Always just following orders, the defense of small men throughout history, the abdication of moral responsibility in the face of authority. Ethan had heard it in Iraq from local officials who facilitated insurgent movements they claimed to oppose. He'd heard it in the mess halls from soldiers who carried out questionable orders because questioning felt harder than compliance. When the security team searched the suspect's vehicle, they found more incendiary devices and a burner phone with text messages revealing a coordinated effort. 2 more men were apprehended approaching the site from different directions. Their phones contained the same messages, specific instructions for when and how to destroy the evidence, with promises of payment from unnamed sources. Dr. Whitaker approached Ethan after the security sweep concluded. "How did you know?" she asked. Ethan shrugged. He'd known because his body had recognized danger before his mind could name it. The hypervigilance that had made civilian life so difficult now serving a purpose beyond his personal survival. When you've seen enough people planning to do harm, you start to recognize the shape of it, he said simply. She studied him with new understanding. "We've been focused so much on the historical crimes that we nearly missed the present danger. These records, they implicate people who still have resources, influence, people who believe they're entitled to make problems disappear." "Just like they've always done," Ethan replied. "Only difference is, this time we were watching." The attempted sabotage accelerated the investigation. State officials, now convinced of ongoing obstruction efforts, authorized additional resources. Federal agencies, initially reluctant to acknowledge their historical role in the detentions, sent teams to assist with document analysis and witness protection. Throughout the fall, each week brought new revelations, arrests, connections between past crimes and present power. The county commissioner resigned after documents revealed his grandfather had falsified death certificates for 3 victims. 2 state representatives with family ties to Ravenon logging announced they wouldn't seek re-election. A federal judge recused himself when his father's name appeared in the detention records. The ripples spread outward, touching institutions far beyond the small town's borders. Scholars began re-examining the Red Scare era through the lens of corporate exploitation. Environmental groups highlighted the connection between political repression and resource extraction. Legal experts debated the implications for statute of limitations in cases involving long-term conspiracies. October brought the first indictments, not just for the cover-up, but for the original crimes. The special prosecutor had found a legal pathway through the statute of limitations by classifying the disappearances as ongoing criminal enterprises and conspiracies that continued to the present day through active concealment and obstruction. Mayor Redgrave was the first to be charged with multiple counts of accessory after the fact, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and destruction of evidence. His attorney immediately held a press conference proclaiming his client's innocence, but the facade cracked when reporters questioned him about the family signet ring, the same one his grandfather had worn in the 1981 video, now on Daniel Redgrave's hand in numerous public photographs. The mayor's house was searched again following his arrest. In a hidden wall safe, investigators found more lists of names, not historical targets, but contemporary ones. Activists who'd opposed recent logging permits, journalists who'd asked questions about water quality, and at the top, Ethan Rollins. Torres called to warn him. They were planning something more permanent than burning your cabin, he said. They had detailed notes on your routines, your vulnerabilities. They were watching for the right moment. Ethan felt an odd detachment hearing this news. The knowledge that he'd been marked for elimination should have terrified him, but instead, it merely confirmed what he'd suspected all along. The enemy had simply become visible, stepping out of shadow into light where they could be confronted directly. He found himself drawn deeper into the process despite his preference for distance. His military experience with security protocols and chain of custody procedures made him valuable to the task force. His first-hand knowledge provided context that outside investigators lacked. Most importantly, his connection with Eliza Caraway and other elderly residents created a bridge between official investigation and community memory. These witnesses, long silenced by fear and disbelief, found in Ethan someone who had already proven his willingness to listen when others wouldn't. 6 weeks after Scout's death, Ethan visited Eliza at the nursing home. She seemed smaller than before, as if telling her story had diminished her physically while strengthening her spirit. They're talking about building a memorial, he told her, seated in the chair across from her rocker, at the falls, for everyone who disappeared. Eliza's hands trembled as they always did, but her gaze remained steady. Will they use their names, all of them? Every single one, Ethan promised. They've identified 17 so far, working on the others. She nodded, satisfaction settling into the deep lines of her face. Then it was worth it. The waiting, the not being believed. She looked toward the window, where autumn light painted the hills in fading gold. I won't see it finished, but I'll know it's coming. Ethan understood. At 85, Eliza had already outlived most of her generation. She'd carried the truth longer than anyone should have to, a burden heavier than years. Now she could set it down. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, he said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. The dog that helped you escape, do you remember anything else about it? Eliza's eyes clouded with memory. Belgian Shepherd, I think they called it. Big ears, serious eyes, always watching. It belonged to one of the guards, but it seemed to have its own ideas about things. Her lips curved in a faint smile. My father always said you could trust a dog's judgment more than a man's. That one judged me worth saving. The description matched the remains they'd found. The military dog named Scout, who had somehow gone from war hero to guard dog to rescuer. The coincidence still felt too precise to be random, as if some cosmic hand had orchestrated these echoes across time. I think it might have been a war dog, Ethan said, brought back from the Pacific after 1945. We found its tags in the tunnel. Eliza's eyes widened slightly. Then it knew something about prisons, didn't it? About what humans do to each other in the name of greater causes. Her fingers worked the edge of her shawl. Animals remember differently than we do, not with words, but with truth. She paused, then added, they killed it after I escaped. I heard them looking for it, calling its name, then a gunshot. I was hiding in the brush, too afraid to move. She closed her eyes briefly. I've wondered all these years if it knew what would happen, if it chose anyway. The conversation stayed with Ethan as he drove back to his temporary home. Animals remember differently. It explained something that had bothered him since the discovery, why his scout had been so insistent about investigating that particular spot, so focused on uncovering what lay beneath. Perhaps dogs passed their knowledge through generations in ways humans couldn't understand. Perhaps Scout had sensed the presence of his namesake's remains, recognized a kinship that transcended time. Or perhaps it was simply that animals, unburdened by human capacity for self-deception, saw clearly what people worked so hard to hide. November brought the first snowfall and a fresh wave of revelations. Investigators following financial records discovered offshore accounts linked to Ravenon Logging's executives, accounts that had received substantial payments from mining companies interested in the copper deposits. What had begun as government-sanctioned detentions during the Red Scare had evolved into corporate murder for profit by the 1970s. The copper deposits beneath Ravenon's forest became central to the investigation. Geologists confirmed what Weiss had claimed: one of the largest undeveloped copper resources in the country, worth billions, but situated in an environmentally sensitive watershed. Any attempt to extract it would threaten the water supply for 3 counties. Ethan began to understand the bigger picture. The disappeared hadn't just been troublemakers or holdouts. They'd been the ones who might have connected the dots. The environmental activists, the teachers, the union organizers who could have mobilized resistance. Their elimination had been strategic, designed to clear the path for eventual extraction. As the investigations continued, something was still missing from the process. Something human, something personal that all the legal proceedings couldn't capture. Ethan found it one evening at the diner on Main Street, where he'd stopped for coffee after another day of interviews and evidence reviews. A woman approached his table, perhaps 60, with eyes that reminded him of Ruth Barker from the ID cards. "My mother disappeared in 1973, she said without introduction. They told us she ran off with a man from Portland. I was 12. Never believed it." She set a photograph on the table, a smiling woman with a young girl on her lap, sitting on the porch of a farmhouse that looked vaguely familiar. "That was our place on Hickory Creek," she continued. "Ravenon Logging wanted it for the water rights. Mom wouldn't sell. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Dad gave up fighting after that. Signed it over for less than half what it was worth." Ethan studied the photograph, understanding now why the house looked familiar. He'd passed it countless times on his supply runs into town, a once proud farmhouse now serving as equipment storage for the county road department. The woman, Barbara, she eventually introduced herself, had more than a story to share. She had questions that decades of official silence had never answered. Not legal questions for prosecutors, but human ones that only someone who had seen the tunnel, the shackles, the hooks might address. Did she suffer? Was she alone? Did she know we were looking for her? Ethan couldn't offer certainty, only honesty. The facility was designed to break people, he told her. But from what I saw, they fought back however they could. They carved their names, they left messages. They wanted to be remembered. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something truth often provided instead. A foundation solid enough to build the rest of a life upon. Barbara thanked him, reclaimed her photograph, and left with straighter shoulders than she'd arrived with. Word spread. Others came. Sons and daughters, nieces and nephews, grandchildren of the disappeared, each carrying fragments of family stories that suddenly made terrible sense. They found Ethan at the diner, at the excavation site, at community meetings about the investigation's progress. He hadn't planned on becoming their confessor, their witness, their connection to truths too painful to face alone. But he recognized in their needs something he'd carried back from Fallujah, the desperate human desire to know, even when knowing hurt more than uncertainty. So he listened. He answered what he could. He admitted what he couldn't know. Most importantly, he affirmed what official reports often obscured, that these weren't just victims of historical forces, but individuals who had resisted in their final moments, who had tried to leave traces of themselves behind, who had screamed even when no one came. This unofficial role brought Ethan back into the community in ways he couldn't have imagined during his years of isolation. The town that had once avoided him now made space, recognizing that his brokenness had enabled him to see what intact people had missed. 3 months after Scout's death, as winter settled over Ravenon, with early snow and bitter winds, Ethan found himself driving to the local animal shelter. Not to replace what couldn't be replaced, but to honor a connection that had saved him once and might save another. The facility was overcrowded, underfunded, staffed by volunteers with more compassion than resources. He walked the rows of kennels slowly, acknowledging each occupant with a word, a gesture. Some pressed eagerly against the chain link. Others hung back, wary of yet another human making promises they wouldn't keep. At the end of the row, in a corner kennel marked special needs, a dog lay curled on a thin blanket. One ear stood upright while the other flopped forward, giving him a perpetually quizzical expression. His coat was brindled, neither one color nor another. When Ethan approached, the dog lifted his head but didn't rise, revealing the reason for his placement in that section. His right front leg ended in a neatly healed stump, an amputation that had been professionally done but left him with an obvious disability. The volunteer following Ethan provided the sparse details. Hit by a car 3 months ago, owner couldn't afford the vet bills, surrendered him, healed up fine, but nobody wants a three-legged dog with gray in his muzzle. Too much work, they think. Ethan knelt by the kennel door. The dog regarded him with amber eyes that held neither fear nor expectation, just a patient assessment that reminded him eerily of his scout's steady gaze. When he extended his hand through the gap in the chain link, the dog sniffed it once, then pressed his head against Ethan's fingers, a simple acceptance that asked nothing in return. Something shifted in Ethan's chest, not the closing of a wound, but the opening of a door he'd thought permanently sealed. This animal knew something about adapting to loss, about continuing despite damage that couldn't be undone. In that, they were already kindred. "What's his name?" Ethan asked. The volunteer consulted her clipboard. Previous owner called him Lucky. Her tone suggested she found the irony distasteful. Ethan considered the dog, who had settled his chin on his remaining front paw, but kept his eyes fixed on the human before him. "That won't work," he decided. "Nothing lucky about what either of us has been through. But we're still here." An hour later, after paperwork and a modest adoption fee, Ethan led his new companion to the truck. The dog managed the short walk with dignity, despite his awkward three-legged gait, neither rushing nor hesitating. He allowed Ethan to lift him onto the passenger seat, then settled into the space as if he'd always belonged there. On the drive home, to the rental cabin that was gradually accumulating the small markers of permanent residence, Ethan glanced at the dog beside him. Not a replacement, not a continuation, something new built on the foundation of what had come before. "Witness," he said aloud. The dog's good ear pricked forward at the sound. "That's your name, if you want it." The newly named witness thumped his tail once against the seat, neither accepting nor rejecting the identity offered. Like Ethan himself, he would become whatever his experiences shaped him to be, carrying forward both the damage and the possibility. That evening, Ethan received a call from Dr. Whitaker with an update on the excavation. They'd found another set of remains, likely dating to the earliest period of the facility. With them, in a journal kept by one of the guards, detailing daily operations in clinical, bureaucratic language. The final entries described the arrival of a dog, a Belgian Malinois transferred from a military training program decommissioned after the war. The animal was intended to serve as additional security, trained to track escapees and intimidate prisoners. But the journal noted with frustration that the dog refused to behave as expected. Instead of threatening detainees, it sought contact with them. Instead of alerting guards to escape attempts, it sometimes seemed to facilitate them. A final entry declared the animal unsuitable for detention operations and recommended its disposal. The date matched the estimated time of death for the canine remains, the original scout whose collar and medal had survived decades underground, the military dog who had chosen mercy over duty, connection over compliance. "We think that's when they sealed that section of the tunnel," Whitaker explained. "After the dog helped Eliza escape, they couldn't risk more prisoners getting out. So they collapsed that chamber, buried the evidence, including the dog they'd killed for its betrayal, and moved operations deeper into the system." Ethan thanked her for the information, a piece of the puzzle that completed a picture he'd been assembling since Scout first scratched at the hidden entrance. 3 generations of dogs connected to this case. The war hero who died helping prisoners escape, his own Scout who discovered the tunnel 70 years later, and now Witness, who would carry forward the legacy of truth-telling in his own way. It wasn't coincidence, it wasn't mysticism. It was simply that animals, unburdened by human capacity for willful blindness, saw clearly what needed to be seen, smelled what was hidden beneath layers of deception, recognized injustice without needing to name it. As winter deepened, the trials began for those still living who had participated in the disappearances or their cover-up. Some pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony. Others maintained innocence despite mounting evidence. A few died before facing judgment, their secrets accompanying them to quieter graves than their victims had received. The town itself was transformed, not just by the physical presence of media, investigators, and tourists drawn by the macabre history, but by a collective reckoning with decades of complicity through silence. Land ownership throughout the county underwent review as forged deeds and fraudulent transfers came to light. Properties were returned to descendants of the disappeared when possible, with compensation funds established when direct restitution couldn't be made. Ravenon Logging Company, its reputation destroyed and assets frozen pending multiple investigations, filed for bankruptcy protection. The copper deposits that had motivated much of the land acquisition were placed under state protection, with requirements for environmental impact studies and indigenous consultation before any extraction could be considered. The secret that had driven decades of violence was now subject to public oversight and regulation. Riley Monroe's testimony before Congress made national headlines. The Congressional Committee announced a broader investigation into similar arrangements between timber companies and federal agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest during the Cold War. Archivists in 3 states reported finding similar patterns of disappearances near logging operations that had received federal contracts in the 1950s. 1 year to the day after Scout had first scratched at the hidden entrance, Ethan returned to the falls with Witness limping steadily at his side. The excavation was complete, the area transformed into what would eventually become a memorial site. Stone markers bore the names of those identified, with space left for others still unknown. The memorial's centerpiece was simple but powerful, a replica of the wall from the tunnel, complete with the handprints of children and the message etched above the hooks. We screamed, no one came. Beside it stood a bronze sculpture of 2 dogs, one a military working dog in harness, the other a civilian companion animal. Their noses touched across the divide of time, one passing something essential to the other. The waterfall thundered as it always had, indifferent to human ceremony, yet somehow bearing witness in its constant presence. Ethan stood before the marker placed for Scout. Both Scouts, the one from 1945 and his own, feeling the weight of the year that had passed. Witness sat beside him, adapting his 3-legged posture to maintain balance on the uneven ground. The dog had settled into his new life with quiet dignity, neither demanding attention nor avoiding connection. His presence was a reminder that wounds could heal even if they left visible marks, that loss didn't have to mean emptiness. Several dozen people had gathered for the memorial's dedication, family members of the identified victims, investigators who'd worked the case, townspeople who'd chosen to confront rather than hide from their community's dark history. Ethan stood at the periphery, uncomfortable with the way eyes kept finding him, as if he were somehow central to this story rather than merely its accidental discoverer. Dr. Whitaker approached after the ceremony. "This place will never be what it was before," she said, looking out over the falls. "For better or worse, it's been transformed." Ethan nodded, watching Witness investigate a patch of melting snow, his 3-legged gait having developed a peculiar grace over the months they'd been together. "I used to think this was where I came to disappear," he said. "Turns out it was where I came to be found." There was a new home under construction near his old property, not on the exact site of his burned cabin, which would be incorporated into the memorial grounds, but close enough to still hear the falls. He'd decided to stay in Ravenon, despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it. The people who'd once avoided him now nodded when they passed on the street. Not friendship exactly, but recognition, acknowledgement of a shared history, however painful. He'd been offered a position with the County Historical Society, documenting not just what had been uncovered at the falls, but the broader pattern of land seizures and disappearances throughout the region. Torres had convinced him to take the job. "You've always been looking backward anyway," he'd said. "Might as well get paid for it." As the crowd dispersed, Ethan remained, watching the last light of the day play across the water. Witness pressed against his leg, a solid presence that anchored him to the present even as his thoughts drifted to the past. Ethan hadn't planned on becoming the voice for those who could no longer speak, the witness for those whose suffering had been deliberately erased. But standing here now, he understood that some roles chose you rather than the other way around. His broken places had made him the right person to see what others had missed, to listen when others turned away, to persist when others surrendered. The truth under Ravenon Falls had been darker than anyone imagined, but truth, once exposed to light, became something else. Not just a record of past horrors, but a foundation for whatever might be built next. Witness nudged his hand with a cold nose, a gentle reminder of present needs amidst historical contemplation. Time to go, time to continue, time to live in the world that disclosure had created, with all its imperfect justice and incomplete healing. They turned away from the memorial, man and dog making their careful way back along the path. Behind them, the waterfall continued its eternal conversation with stone, wearing away resistance drop by persistent drop. Ahead lay a town still reckoning with its past, still uncertain of its future, but no longer defined by its silence. Ethan felt the presence of all the scouts, the one who had died helping prisoners escape, the one who had found the tunnel decades later, and his own enduring spirit alongside him as he walked. Not ghosts, but witnesses. Not an ending, but a continuation. The secret beneath Ravenon Falls had been exposed, but the real revelation wasn't about the darkness that humans could create. It was about the persistence of truth, the endurance of memory, and the quiet courage of those who refused to let either be buried forever. Some wounds never fully healed. Some absences remained unfilled. But as Ethan and Witness made their way home through the gathering dusk, he understood that brokenness wasn't the opposite of wholeness. It was simply another form of it, carrying forward both damage and possibility in equal measure. The waterfall roared on, but now it no longer sounded like camouflage for secrets better left buried. It sounded like testimony, eternal and unyielding. It sounded like remembrance. It sounded at last like truth.